After all these wonderfully imaginative readings that you've been hearing, what I'm about to read to you may seem a little pedestrian. My Hamilton sequence is about ordinary people coping with what life throws at them in Ireland. I don't do politics, I just do the effects of what things can happen in your life. My last novel was about the famine in the eastern part of Ulster, and I decided I wanted to write a parallel one for the western side of Ulster, which of course is very different. Everybody's famine was different, but those were very markedly contrasted. So I'm going to read you the start of a new novel, which may never see the light of day, because the publishers may not like it. At the moment it's called Number 14, because I did write 3 novels before I wrote The Hamiltons. I call it The Woman from Galloway, but they won't like that either. You can call it whatever you like. The main character is Hannah McGinley. Hannah McGinley put down her sewing and moved across the tramped earth floor to where the door of the cottage stood open through all the daylight hours, except in the coldest and stormiest of weather. She stood on the well-swept doorstone, looked up at the pale, overcast sky, and ran her eye along the stone walls that enclosed their small potato patch, the garden, and the hawthorns that partly masked the stony track which ran down the mountainside. There was no sign of them yet. No familiar figures walked, ran, or skipped up the narrow rocky path leading steeply up the mountainside from the broader track that made its way along the lower contours of the mountain above the final bush-filled slopes that dropped more gently to the shore of Loch Garten. The only movement she could detect in the deep quiet of the grey, late April afternoon were flickers of light reflected from the calm surface of the lake itself, just visible between the still bare trees and the pale rise of smoke from the cottage of her nearest neighbour. Dotted along the mountainside above the lake, clusters of cottages like Ardtour itself huddled together in the shelter of the mountain, its brooding shape offering some defence against the battering of westerly winds from the Atlantic, westerlies that brought both mildness and heavy rain to this rugged landscape. She moved back again to the hearth, hung the kettle over the glowing embers of the turf fire, and took up her sewing again. She paused to push back from her face a few strands of long, fair hair. Touching the gleaming strands, she smiled to herself, thinking of her daughter. Rose, as dark as she herself was fair, her eyes and colouring so like Patrick, her husband, while Sam, a year younger, pale-skinned and red-haired, so closely resembled her own father, Duncan Mackay, far away in Scotland, where she herself had been born and grew up. They were good children, she reflected, always willing to help with whatever task she might have in hand. Rose, the older, patient and thoughtful, Sam, quick, often too impatient, but always willing to do as she asked. Even now, though he was lightly built and only 7 years old, he would run to help if he saw her move to lift a creel of potatoes or turf, or pick up the empty pails to fetch water from the well. She thought for a moment of her everyday tasks and reflected that even after all these years, she had not become entirely familiar with the harsh yet beautiful place where she had lived for the 10 years of her married life. After all this time, she still thought every morning of the well-built 2-story farmhouse in Galloway, and looked out from the south-facing window in the bedroom she shared with her older sister. Then she had seen a very different landscape, green trees and fields sloping gently towards the seashore, rich pasture dotted with sheep, well cared for and prosperous, the delight of her hard-working father, who loved his land as well, or perhaps even better, than he loved his God. Duncan Mackay was seen by many as a hard man, one who did not suffer fools gladly, shrewd in his dealings, strong in his Covenanter beliefs, and not given to generosity. But to his youngest daughter, Hannah, he showed a gentleness few others ever saw. It was Hannah's sorrow that in making her own life she had had to leave him, widowed and now childless, her brothers and sisters married and moved into their own lives, two of them far away in Nova Scotia. She knew her father still grieved for the choice she had made, though he had long ago accepted the quality of the man she married, but it had been hard for him. Patrick McGinley was a landless labourer, one of the many that took the boat from Derry or Belfast or the small ports nearest to the glens of Antrim, and went over to Scotland and the north of England to provide extra labour on the farms. From May to late October, the haymakers came, lived in a barn that was cleared out for them each springtime, and worked on the land, sending home each week the money to support their families on rough hillsides and tiny holdings like this one, where the only source of food was potatoes, and the earnings of the few women who had the skill to do white work or sprigging or embroidery. For 3 years, Patrick had come with a group of men and boys from Donegal, all good workers, as her father freely acknowledged. While they frequently worked on neighbouring farms, their best was Mackay's, the farm south and east of Dundrennan, the one her father had bought after long years of working with his brother in the drapery trade in Dumfries. Duncan had always wanted his own farm. His elder brother Ross had once told Hannah that even as a small boy in their home in the far northwest of Scotland, he had talked about it. He'd explained to Ross when he was still a boy that he wanted good soil and fine pasture, not like the poor piece of land they rented from an English landlord they had never seen. Years later, when Ross and Duncan arrived barefoot and penniless in Dumfries, two victims of the Sutherland clearances, turned out of their croft and land in Strathnaver with only the clothes they wore and what few possessions they could carry as they tramped south looking for the means of survival, it seemed that his dream had remained intact. They had found work for two strong lads with a draper in the town. According to Ross, even in those first years, Duncan had already begun to save from his meagre salary for his farm. Hannah would never forget the way her father told parts of their story over and over again throughout her childhood. Every time they sat down to eat, he would give thanks for their food, even if it were only a bowl of porridge. He reminded them time and time again that he and their Uncle Ross had travelled the length of Scotland on burn water and the kindness of the poor, with no place to lay their head but the heather on the hill.